All right, welcome back to Chapter 2. We are in Part 2 here of our lecture series on this chapter. Here we'll be going into other aspects of chemicals, which is solubility and dissociation. So these are kind of vernacular words or vocabulary words of chemistry, which is important to nursing and to anatomy and physiology, because when we get into the renal system, urinary system, even cardiovascular system, when we talk about things dissolving into the bloodstream, water, this comes up a lot. So solubility is the ability of one substance to dissolve into another. So think of like table salt in water, sugar in water, right? Those ions can dissolve and become part of the water, releasing their atoms into the water, right, as the figure shows. But we know from hopefully firsthand experience, oils do not dissolve into water. They are insoluble, right? So when you have oil, like olive oil, when you cook with water, put in water and that forms droplets, right? It's not those chemicals, the molecules that make up that oil are not getting mixed and dispersed randomly into the water, right? So solubility. Oils can dissolve oils, right? So that's solubility, right? So it really depends, solubility really depends upon what you're dissolving, the substance you're trying to dissolve, and the substance you're using to dissolve, right? So that's where solubility comes in. Dissociation is really talking about separation of specifically ions, ionic bonds, right? Because technically ionic bonds dissolve in water, but if the bond is so strong in the ionic molecule, it's going to be really hard to dissociate or separate those atoms in the ionic bond for them to dissolve into the water, right, and become separated and surrounded by water molecules. So solubility is an important factor, and the dissociation, which is kind of the function of that, is also an important thing to note. Because it can't, just because it can dissolve, it has solubility in water, doesn't mean it necessarily will, because there needs to be something to help it dissolve. Maybe you have to boil, right, the water, add heat in. Maybe you need to add more water in because it's too concentrated, the chemical you're trying to dissolve in, right? So these two things are important to understand. In terms of the body and in chemistry, but you probably have heard this a lot. You need to drink electrolytes. You need to get this in your body. That's why you're cramping, right? Well, electrolytes are really just basically liquid solutions that have dissociated cations and anions in the water. So cations, which are molecules with a positive charge, and the anions with negative charge. The way I remember these two words, cations and anions, is cations has a T, which you form a cross in, which a positive sign is like a cross. So that's how I memorize it. There's other ways to memorize it, but that's the way I have that kind of organized in my head, right? Because of electrolytes, we can form currents, right, which we detect via electrodes, because current goes from positive to negative. So hence, it's important electrolytes and non-electrolytes are important for neuronal function and signaling. Now, non-electrolytes dissolve in water. They don't dissociate and they don't conduct electricity, right? So that's kind of the important thing for electrolytes. They will dissolve but not dissociate, i.e. break the bonds, right? So there's certain molecules, say like sugars, carbohydrates. So we keep our vernacular correct here. Carbohydrates, they can dissolve in water, but they will not dissociate, as in break their bonds down to the rudimentary atomic structure, and they do not conduct electricity, right? Versus salts, like table salt, will both has solubility in water, disassociates down into its basic atomic elements. And because of that, because of the positive and negative charging of those sodium and chloride, it will form an electrical current. Excuse me. So that's kind of help you differentiate between the two. And because of this, we need to properly regulate the amount of electrolytes in the body, right? Especially when it comes to muscle and neuronal function, right? Homeostasis. When you have the hankering for table salt, homeostasis is sending it to your brain, go look some salt. So that's that. Now, chemical reactions is another form here. I'll highlight this here, and then we'll kind of go into examples of what examples do we care about. So a chemical reaction is where an atom or an ion, right, has positive and negative charge, or molecules or compounds that interact with one another to either form a bond or break a bond. And in each reaction, you have a reactant, which are the substances that are required to, cause the reaction to occur, right? And then the product, which is what is produced. Products could be heat. It could be another molecule. It could be, taking one molecule to making multiple molecules, right? So there's always a reactant, and there's always a product. Now, in terms of our chemical bonds, there's kind of some important vernacular here, and it comes up, especially when we talk about metabolism in the human body. Synthesis reactions, which make bonds, it's called anabolism. When you are breaking bonds, you're decomposing them, you're catabolizing, having a catabolism reaction, right? And that's when you break the bonds apart, right? And these are important because combining anabolism and catabolism reactions provides energy and heat and so forth for homeostasis. Now, metabolism is kind of the sum-all, catch-all phrase that we use, but really what it means is it's the sum of all the anabolic reactions combined with all the catabolic reactions in the body to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so that's what we mean by metabolism. We think of it in terms of like eating and drinking and so forth, but really when we break it down in physiology, it means our cells are breaking bonds and making bonds. Now, one example of this, catabolism, anabolism reactions is energy, ATP. So ATP is a molecule that is really the battery for life. A lot of organisms, most organisms, again, there's no absolutes, so being safe, most organisms use ATP as their battery energy source, and the body constantly does anabolism and catabolism reactions of ATP and ADP, going back and forth, to store and produce energy. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So there's a molecule, adenosine, combined with 3 phosphate molecules, right? ADP is adenosine with diphosphates or 2 phosphates. You can even go down to 1 phosphate. So it's adenosine monophosphate or AMP, right? All this is to say that when adenosine is paired with X number of phosphates, it's storing energy. The more phosphates you have attached to adenosine, up to 3, we don't go higher than 3, based on chemical octet rules here, you're storing more energy, right? So when we take ADP, which has 2 phosphates, and add a phosphate group that requires energy up in part A, we make ATP. So now it has 3 phosphates, so we're storing energy. Now when we talk about catabolism, we break down ATP, so we take the 3 phosphates attached to adenosine, we cut one off. What this does is it releases the energy stored up in that chemical bond, right? Because chemical bonds is a way to store energy just as much as heat is, or kinetic movement is a form of energy. chemical bonds are a form of energy, and when you break them, they have to release that energy. Again, back to quantum physics, not going into that. But the body and God knows that we need a battery or storage place to store this energy, and he designed ATP to be that battery source. So when you break ATP down into ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, it releases a phosphate plus energy. So the body goes back and forth between making ATP and breaking down ATP. So anabolism and catabolism, right? So this is going to be a big kind of, I'm going to use a fancy word, motif here. So a repeating element is what motif means, right? Throughout physiology and biology, this motif is ATP and ADP as energy sources in terms of chemical bonds and formations and breakdowns. So you really want to understand this. So I will pause the lecture there. We'll move on to other forms of, chemical reactions and so forth. But I think this is a good stopping point.